Good afternoon and warmly welcome to Fikasnack om framtidens utbildning, Fikachatt on Future of Education. My name is Johan, I am the pod host and I am co-shared by Joakim Lilliesköld.
Hello.
And
Yes.
Today we also have a guest, Dr. Ruth Graham. Warmly welcome to the pod.
Thank you very much.
This pod is, and this is for new viewers and listeners, it's a casual conversation between peers on things that concern education and the development of education within KTH, but also, of course, internationally. We do this live. We have some basic questions, but it's not a scripted or a perfected discussion. So with that little disclaimer, we will of course try to stay on topic and do the very best we can, but if we say something wrong, we might, it happens during a live conversation. But let's start a little bit. Joakim, you are the coordinator of Future of Education at KTH, and Ruth, you are visiting KTH. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes. So by background, I'm a mechanical engineer, but I work as a consultant in educational change in universities across the world. So I've worked as a consultant for about 15 years. Some of those projects I work on are public projects, a lot of benchmarking, actually looking at best practice globally, but also looking at specific challenges facing change. For example, the reward and recognition systems, the promotion systems that underpin academic careers. But I also work individually with universities and schools making changes, informing and supporting the changes that they're making.
And from our side, we are joining in one of these studies right now, the one transforming the recognition of university teaching. Can you tell us, because that is a project that is about to start? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So to me, one of the biggest challenges facing change in higher education is the system of reward and recognition, the extent to which teaching and learning is rewarded and recognized in academic careers. And I've been working over the last 10 years with a group of universities from across the world who are committed to making change, to looking at what are the challenges facing the system, but actually making systemic changes to not just the career pathways, but all of the other institutional processes that support that. So how do you evaluate academics every year, through those processes? What are the criteria? What are the systems of professional development available for academics? And how do you support that career progression, particularly as an educator, through to being an educational leader, for example? So I've been doing a lot of work over the last 10 years to support change within institutions. But one of the questions a lot of universities have asked me is, what are the best practices? If you look around the world, what is happening and who can we learn from? What are they doing? What challenges did they have to overcome, and what kind of changes did they make? So this project, which will last throughout the upcoming academic year, will look to identify those best practices and actually put together a handbook for universities making change so that they can draw on these examples of best practice and learn from others. And KTH is one of the universities that is supporting and co-funding that study over the coming year.
Really good, and from our side, it's really interesting. It's been an ongoing debate for a long time here, and it's really crucial as in the different principles we have for the future of education. So it's going to be really interesting to learn more in that process also. Is anyone really good at this, would you say? Or are we just complaining as academics all the time? Or
I think what's interesting is that firstly, there's a huge commitment to change. I think if you'd have asked somebody 15 years ago in any institution worldwide, are we as a community, as a sector, going to tackle the issue of reward and recognition for teaching in academic career pathways? I think most people would have said probably not, actually. You know, this is such a endemic, ingrained cultural issue. Making changes to that, particularly when universities so often are evaluated on the basis of research performance and impact. Yeah, how are we going to make a change here when it's, say, so culturally ingrained? The shift that's happened over the last 15 years, and particularly actually over the past 5 years, has been huge. I mean, it's to me, it's been a surprise, actually, the extent to which not only are universities saying we want to make a change, but they're actually rolling out that change. I think in terms of there would be no institution that's done it and completed the process. But I think there are a lot of institutions and countries actually that are going through a really well-informed, community-driven process of change. So I think you've got universities like UCL in the UK. You know, that's a well-regarded research-led institution, but they've completely changed their career pathways. And the reward and recognition of teaching is absolutely at the center of that. And you've also got countries that are making change. So all Dutch research universities, all 14 universities in the Netherlands together are making a change to their career pathways. And it's now a process of change that's supported by the government, and very much each institution is taking a different approach. But I think there's some really interesting, good practices coming out of those institutions that I think other institutions could learn quite a lot from.
Yeah, and it's going to be very interesting to benchmark KTH here. There's been a lot of work done here as well, but to see where we stand. So we really look forward to this work and study. Yeah,
yes.
And over the years, you've done several reports around this. Looking at culture and looking at rewards recognition. So there's a lot of reading material also to look at.
There is. I mean, I think that there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. And I think one of the things that's prevented change is, you know, how do you manage the process of changing an institutional promotion process? For so many different aspects that you need to think about, both in terms of the structural changes, but also in terms of the cultural changes. So working with this wider group of institutions, there's been a number of studies that we've conducted over the last 7 or 8 years, trying to answer some of those questions. And actually, one of the things we're doing is what's called a teaching culture survey. But it's a survey tracking those institutions, or 25 of those institutions that are making systemic changes to their promotion systems. And we're tracking over time the culture amongst faculty, the attitudes and experiences of faculty towards teaching and learning, and their sense of the extent to which they feel that their institution takes rewarding teaching seriously. And we're tracking that over time. We've just finished last year the second survey, and then we've got the third survey in a couple of years' time. And I think that, again, that process of, you know, looking at actually what is the impact of some of these changes on the everyday experiences and the aspirations of individual faculty members.
And it's great. I think we need that kind of longitudinal studies and evidence to see that we really do get an impact and change of culture if we can work with this system.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think actually it's interesting to see how much commonality there is. You know, obviously every institution is different, and priorities and cultures are different. But I think around certain issues, and I think this is one of them, a lot of the problems that universities face are the same. And I think that's one thing that's been really interesting, bringing people together and having these conversations and the results of the surveys, that actually there's so much more commonality than you anticipate. And you know, this survey is across 10 countries. You know, we've got universities in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, in all sorts of parts of the world. But actually, in terms of the challenges and opportunities for change and the experiences of people within their institutions, it's remarkably similar. It's really interesting how much commonality there is.
Yeah, well, that's very, very interesting. And you say also that the will to change is coming in all these universities. In that is that from inside the university, or is it more driven by the governments or regulations?
I think it varies. So, for example, in Malaysia, the government has asked for all institutions, all universities, to change their reward and recognition system. So, in a sense, that the drive there is more top down. But I would say at most institutions, certainly that I'm working with, I think it's a top-down appreciation, an appreciation by university leadership of the inequality, but really responding to that feedback from the faculty, from the bottom up. So I think, but it's very much coming from within those institutions. And I think a recognition that there's an imbalance, that obviously, while rewarding and recognizing excellence in research and innovation is incredibly important, that there is an imbalance there. And that actually, when you're striving to improve the student experience, you're striving to improve the education, that actually rewarding and recognizing excellence and impact in teaching and learning is important. So I think that is something that's very much coming from different institutions. I mean, I think there are different drivers, you know, in many universities, many countries, students are paying higher fees, that, you know, that there are more pressures for robust evaluations of impact in teaching and learning. So I think there are external pressures, but for a lot of the institutions we're working with, it's coming from a recognition of we need to rebalance and to think about what role teaching and learning is playing in all aspects of the university operation and culture.
Yes, very good. Do you want to take the question in the chat?
Yes, we have a chat question. We always appreciate those. So thank you, Oliver, for asking. How can education be more inclusive and equitable? Equality. How can we have a higher sense of equality there? Disparities in access to quality education remains a significant challenge. How can education be made more inclusive and accessible for marginalized communities, students with disabilities, and those in remote or underserved areas?
Mm-hmm.
Big question, but interesting, of course.
Absolutely. I mean, I mean, I think the experience of emergency teaching taught us quite a lot. And I think it turned a spotlight on some of those inequalities that weren't actually always visible to institutions, you know, the different kinds of challenges and backgrounds that students are coming from, and dealing and tackling in terms of accessing their education. And I think there are some really interesting tools and ways of connecting that were developed over the last, or have been developed over the last 3 years, that I think offer access to students in a different way to their education, a much more flexible way of learning, flexible around caring responsibilities, flexible around second jobs. So I think that there are some opportunities there, but I think access and equality is in terms of the next major challenges facing higher education. I think access and equality are going to be two huge issues that institutions really going to have to address quite carefully.
Yeah, and addressing that means also that we need to we should say recognize, taking that into account when you're teaching. So this whole study of rewards and recognition is crucial to, and from the future of education principles, many of these principles goes into this, and it's something we really need to step up our work with in order to drive the changes we need to do. So it's really interesting. But I would like to switch subject a little, because we have a short talk here, and a little bit because this is one of your big domains that we looked a lot at and tried to cooperate and work with, and be part of the study. But the other one is that you also looked a lot on this, where is engineering education heading? Can you just say a few words of that?
Absolutely. I mean, again, I think similar to the work on reward and recognition, there's been a huge change in engineering education. I did a study in 2018 for MIT looking at the global state of the art, and it was really striking that and really this is continuing to accelerate, but the extent to which engineering schools and universities are changing practices. The rate of change is incredibly high. And where I would say 10 or 15 years ago, it was the outliers that were making changes. I think now, looking across the board, and I think there are a lot of drivers for this, and I think, you know, competition between peer institutions is one of them, but there are few engineering schools and universities that aren't looking at systemic changes, and I think there are an awful lot of different aspects to that. I mean, I think we mentioned equity and inclusion, but I think there are an awful lot of other things, you know, the capacity of students to tackle authentic problems, the flexibility in learning and learning pathways. I think a real focus on the competencies and competency development, so, and particularly around mindsets. And again, this I think is something that during the lockdown period and COVID-19, a real focus on competencies like resilience and agility, students' ability to overcome these unexpected and challenging periods of time. But actually, how do you develop those kind of competencies over time? And I think also actually turning a spotlight on how do we do that within the curriculum? And I think in a lot of institutions, if you talk about all of these personal and professional competencies, particularly around mindsets, how do we develop critical thinking? How do we develop communication and teamwork? That very often, I think in engineering programs, we say, well, we put them in a team. We give them a team project in their first year and their final year, and therefore that box is ticked. And I think it was interesting during lockdown that actually you put students in teams, and it's incredibly problematic to be part of a functioning team with open communication that's really equitable when you're all sitting on Zoom together. And actually, I think that really laid bare the extent to which, for many institutions, they don't necessarily develop those skills. They put students in a team and expect it to happen. So I think really thinking about what are the experiences that help students to develop those competencies, and how do you build them progressively over time, so that each experience builds upon one another, becomes more complex, stretches the students, but does that in a structured way throughout their degree. I think those sorts of that kind of thinking and development is very much, when you look at the institutions at the forefront of development in engineering education, those are the sorts of things that they're looking at. And I think the big thing as well is scale. That a lot of the institutions that perhaps would have institutions have looked to for excellence in engineering education are actually operating with relatively high levels of resource, with relatively small numbers of students. And I think when you look at institutions like Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, who are doing some of these really interesting innovations, they're thinking about the competency development, they're giving students flexibility, they're asking them to tackle authentic problems, they're doing it at scale. And I think those are the institutions that really will set the path for the future in terms of influencing and showcasing best practice.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and that's one of the things we saw a lot when we did the benchmarking in the future of education, that you put a lot of focus on these, and basically, sometimes not soft skills, but the engineering skills to actually work as an engineer and build on that, but also there was a lot of focus on solving real problems in many of these universities as well. And this kind of skills comes in, I guess, to solve these kind of problems. Can you tell us a little bit about what you observed there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think some of the really interesting programs are ones where students are asked to solve perhaps a team-based, authentic open-ended project problem, where they need to pull knowledge from all sorts of different spheres and kind of pull that together and integrate what they're learning throughout their engineering degrees. And some really interesting programs now are asking students to do that relatively independently, so that you are confronted with a problem and you need to identify, what do I need to understand in order to tackle this? What kind of concepts, what kind of abilities and competencies do I need to master in order to solve the problem? And then identifying that in perhaps an online curriculum, identifying those, accessing them independently, mastering them independently, and then applying them. So Aalborg University, for example, in Denmark, is moving towards this model. It's a PBL university. 50% of the curriculum is projects, but actually they're looking at that other 50% as, can we put those online so that the students access those independently? But it actually means that the focus for the on-campus learning, the face-to-face learning, is very much based around the projects and problems that students are solving. And very often the other courses that they work on collaboratively through peer learning, and that they're not necessarily isolated experiences. But the focus for being on campus is very much more directed towards those projects. I mean, that's something again that Monterey, Tech de Monterey are doing, and others. But I think that blend of intensive team-based real challenges with very independent learning, where students are driven by, I need to solve this problem, and I need to understand fluid flow in order to do that, or I need to be able to communicate with this particular stakeholder group, and they identify it. And I think in terms of building students' intrinsic motivation for learning, nothing like needing something now to really drive that independence of learning as well. So I think those are some of the programs that I think are really interesting, but again, doing that at scale. And doing that in a way that's, that's like all of those experiences are high quality and really carefully designed. It's not an easy process.
No, I think that's the big challenge. It's a very tricky process. We have several of those fantastic kind of programs where you actually manage to integrate, and we have them where you add it on, where you don't have. But how do we scale this? How do we systemize this in a way that we give this opportunity to more students, basically, and also trigger them to start learn even more. We take for granted they want to learn more, and get away from this. What is this going to be on the exam, and drive the learning? I think pandemic also showed a little. If you look into digitalization and you see how that can challenge university, I think pandemic for sure. Pandemic for sure brought this to attention for us that we things are going to change and we need to adapt to this. Before that, it was digitalization might happen, but I think that's true. So going back to the roots of engineering education is a very interesting opportunity right now.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the challenges, obviously, is so much material was generated during the pandemic, online sort of digital material that wasn't necessarily of high quality, and nobody's fault. A lot of things had to be created quickly. But I think at this stage now, identifying those materials that are keepers, that we actually want to integrate into the education, and how do we improve the rest of the education? Because I think for some students, digital learning is watching an online lecture, and actually this, that's in terms of high quality active learning, there's so much more that can be done. But I think the potential is there, and I think that process that everybody went through of understanding what is it for my students to be actively engaged. This piece of work that I did looking at the impact of COVID-19 emergency teaching on engineering education, I think that the process that's almost every faculty member I spoke to talked about their concern for the students, their real sense that our students are isolated, they're struggling with their mental health, they're struggling to get engaged with courses. And I think for so many people who were teaching during that time, really having to think very much about how do I actively engage students? What mechanisms can I put in place to connect them so that they have meaningful collaborations with peers? What can I do to support the mental health of my students, and how do I integrate that into the learning, and what does that look like? So I think actually that process that everybody who's taught in an engineering school worldwide over the last 3 years has been through, I think really lays fabulous foundations for creating energizing, active, collaborative digital material. The challenge is, that the scale is huge, and the creation of that, in terms of from the teacher, but also from the support services from the institution, it's a big job.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. Do you, what you say? We talked about this. One thing I think of interest in the study too, for us to really reflect on, is that you show that historically the leading universities been in the Europe and the US, and you see a change. You're talking about Monterey, and you talk about this. Can you elaborate a little on that? Should we be scared as European universities, and do we need what is it we need to do?
I think there is a shift. It was really interesting in this the MIT study looking at best practices in engineering education. When I talk to people about which institutions are delivering best practice now, and then I also asked which institutions do you think will define the future. The extent to which they identified institutions outside the US and Europe amongst the future leaders was really striking, given that the vast majority of institutions they identified as current leaders were either US based or Europe based. So I think there is a shift. I think it's more about the speed and trajectory rather than perhaps where some of these institutions are now. But I think a lot of people are looking at at institutions that are making very rapid, very far-reaching change and investing very significantly. So I think there is. My sense is, as people look at leadership in engineering education and which institutions should I be benchmarking myself against, I think that it's a very open kind of set of institutions. I think it's less predefined by who are the top universities for engineering in the world university rankings. And I think for a long time, that's how people identified the best universities in teaching and learning. Then you've got these kind of maverick institutions like Olin College in the US that I think really disrupted that. And people started thinking, actually, there are other universities, other programs outside of this group. And I really do think there's whichever institutions are able to deliver effective, active learning, flexible learning at scale, will be in a leadership position wherever they are in the world. But I'm certainly looking with a lot of interest. I have a lot of conversations actually at the moment, particularly in Latin America, with universities making quite profound changes to their programs. And I think being led, universities like Tec de Monterrey that are kind of the forerunners, but actually there's a lot of interesting things happening all over the world, but not necessarily in the institutions that we would identify as the leaders in research, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. Have we catered too much to our students in the Western world? We talk about this learning and working together as a team and everything, but everything is set up and catered for them. Is this one of the things that actually they get a lot of this training from basically the situation they are in the sense that the lab equipment may not be there? They might need to do invention to make a lab, and the challenges you need to address them.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think I think, you know, catering to students is often a very positive thing. You know, sometimes I think students find courses very difficult and problematic, and push back against them, and actually find in 5 years time, well, this was transformative, and this is what I use daily, and I have a completely different view on it. But actually, I mean, I think for a lot of other institutions that don't have the lab equipment and don't have the particularly the IT infrastructure, I think it's a huge challenge for them to be able to deliver high quality teaching and learning, and I think that's an inequality that's grown actually since through the pandemic. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think so much of it, I mean, if you've got the will to do something, and if throughout the institution you've got the will to do something, you know, you can make a lot of things happen. But at the same time, I think there are things that require, you know, investment. You know, there are things like flexible learning spaces that actually, if you don't have them, it's very, very difficult to do effective group work where students have the support, you know, so that they can come on campus and access the internet and that, you know, all of those things that you provide on a campus. So I think to me, lack of investment is
it's a bigger challenge.
It's a bigger challenge.
Joakim and Ruth, we are reaching the end of this time that we have allotted. I could listen a lot longer because it's been really, really interesting, Ruth, to gain insights into your perspectives on this field, which is so important and so dear to KTH also, because we are currently investing heavily into the future education. You will also hold a few seminars, so those interested in learning more can go to the intranet very quickly to find out where, if you want to have more of this. But for now, I need to thank you both for taking time and share your insights and perspectives, and the conversation will continue because this field is in constant forward motion, so to speak, and it's up to us to be part of that change. But it's been really rewarding, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.